Inner Chaos by Hades. Chapter 19. Oh, what a morning. Greven wiped the sweat from his brow, the heat of the room rising with each song played. However, that was not what was causing him to sweat. No, that honor belonged to the mare that was currently slow dancing with him on a darker portion of the dance floor. The two held one another closely as they swayed to the music, his arms wrapped around her barrel while her forehooves were wrapped around his neck and shoulders. He expected to be holding each mare this way during their respective dances. However, he wasn't expecting anything beyond that, and the mare he was dancing with now had other ideas. Fluttershy had her wings ruffled, nearly extended, letting their tips brush over his hands as she pressed into him. Her muzzle was pressed into the crook of his neck, her lips brushing over his skin in a very teasing manner, her mane brushing over his back and shoulder with each movement. Occasionally she would tilt her head up and playfully nip at his ear, letting her hot breath wash over his skin, which would cause him to tense and blush furiously, which would only make her giggle softly. It had been nearly an hour into the dance before G.J. Pondry had decided to begin to play some slower songs, and by that point, Twilight, Applejack, and Fluttershy had enjoyed several mugs of hard cider, while he had felt it would be best to only sip his drink. He honestly didn't know how they did it. For being such little ponies, they could handle their alcohol far more effectively than most dwarves he had encountered back in Bastion. It baffled him, honestly. But despite their hardy nature, these ponies could still get drunk, and that was exactly the situation he was dealing with now. Fluttershy had not forgotten about her request to be the first to slow dance with him, and once the song began, she pulled him out onto the dance floor as fast as she could get her hooves around his arm. Once out on the floor, she simply stared up at him for a few moments with glassy cyan eyes and a clear red hue on her cheeks before hopping up and wrapping her hooves around him.
Thank you for dancing with me, Greven.
He smiled and nodded. It's not a problem, Fluttershy. He felt her press against him as they began moving, and for a time all was going well, until he heard her giggle a bit, and then felt the brush of her lips against his neck. Fluttershy? She didn't answer at first, and instead lightly nipped at his ear, letting a soft sigh out as she ruffled her wings a bit.
I've wanted to dance with you for a while, you know. Ever since your welcome to Ponyville party.
He blushed and nodded as he continued to move with her through the song. From the corner of his eye, he could see Twilight and Applejack scowling a bit in their direction. I see. I didn't realize that. He felt her nuzzle in once more, brushing her lips against his collar as she nodded her head.
Oh yes, I was just too nervous at that point to come up to you.
She fluttered her wings slightly and sighed once more into his ear.
I've never danced like this before. I could stay like this with you for a long time, you know.
From that point on, red flags were going off in his mind every time she nuzzled against him or teasingly brushed her wings over his arms. He knew it had to be the tranks affecting her. This pony would never be so open and touchy-feely if she were sober. The worst part for him was that she was beginning to have an effect on him. He did his best to keep his thoughts on the straight and narrow, while trying to avoid other slow dancing couples. But he was a man, after all, and even the most resistant of men could only take so many minutes of feeling her hot breath washing over their skin, her nipping at their ear, and her hot form pressing against them. Fortunately, the song ended, and he was able to pull himself away from the cream-colored mare and put a small bit of distance between them. Fluttershy quickly ducked her head under her mane once more, and shifted a bit on her hooves as she stood up in front of him.
I really enjoyed that dance, Greven. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it too.
He cleared his throat a bit and nodded as he tried to rid the lump in his throat. Yes, it was nice. I think you danced very well, considering you had to balance on my shoulders a bit. She smiled as she began to move off the dance floor.
Oh no, that wasn't a problem for me at all. I actually enjoyed it.
He wasn't able to reply to that, however, because as soon as Fluttershy stepped off the dance floor, Twilight all but ran on, heading straight toward him, her eyes showing a mix between a look of anger and determination. She was still dressed in her Van Pony costume despite how late the evening was, including her piercing red eyes, but Grevin could still tell that she, like her shy friend, had imbued quite a bit of alcohol thanks to the red hue of her cheeks and the way she swayed as she walked toward him.
Alright, it's my turn.
He smiled as best he could as he heard another slow song begin, and before he knew it, Twilight had hopped up, wrapping her forelegs around his neck. She didn't rest her head on his shoulder, however, but simply began by holding herself in front of his face so she could stare into his eyes, a small smile playing across her lips. Grevin began to move with her to the music when she pulled in a bit closer, moving her lips just inches from his, causing him to frown slightly. "Twilight?" She said nothing for a moment before her eyes became half-lidded and glossy, her smile growing, showing off her fangs in the dim light.
Grevin, do you know how handsome you look in that costume?
He blinked and averted his gaze, clearing his throat once more. Well, thank you, Twilight. Your costume is quite nice as well. It suits you well. She grinned and moved closer, letting her barrel press against his chest a bit.
Really? I planned that on purpose. I wanted to make sure it impressed you.
He glanced back, looking at her, taking in the sight briefly again. You did? She grinned and lightly darted a tongue over one of her fangs in her mouth and nodded.
Of course. I'm not that confident about how I look, so I asked Rarity for some help.
She leaned in and whispered softly in his ear, while letting her fangs ever so slightly scrape across his neck in a teasing gesture.
And, judging from the way I've seen you react to it, her help was worth it.
He tried to pull back, only to have her follow him, keeping herself in very close proximity. He knew that she had quite a bit to drink this evening, and he was afraid she was going to try something again, so he felt best to speak up now before things got too far. Twilight, you've... She giggled a bit before lightly nipping at his ear, stopping his sentence cold and pulling back from him to let her head rest on his shoulder.
Don't worry, Grevin. I'm not going to try anything too bad. Not yet, anyway. I just saw how Fluttershy kept teasing you, and I wanted to do that a bit as well.
He frowned a bit, even as he let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding in. So, you're not going to... you know. She giggled and nuzzled against him as they moved to the music.
Try and kiss you? Maybe bite a bit? Perhaps even make out with you here on the dance floor? No, well, not yet.
She leaned her head up and stared at him with those eyes and licked her lips.
I could do that, though, if you'd like me to.
She let the statement hang in the air a moment, but couldn't help but giggle at the look she saw on Grevin's face after a few seconds. His jaw was dropped slightly, his cheeks were a deep shade of red, and it appeared he was trying to find some words to speak in response. Twilight simply giggled and returned her head to the gentle embrace she had with him before, and continued to move to the music.
Just teasing, I promise.
He sighed a bit and shook his head as he let his hands wrap around her barrel once more. He began to move with her to the soft, gentle song, enjoying the moment of peace. You know, it isn't nice to tease, Twilight. She nodded, letting her cheek nuzzle against his slightly.
I know, but it's fun, and I know that in a day or so, we need to get to work on our research, so I figured it would be better to get it out of my system now, so I can really focus on our work.
He blinked a moment before nodding in agreement. Makes sense, I suppose. You really planned it out, didn't you?
She smirked as she nuzzled closer, taking in his scent. Of course. I'm the most organized pony in Ponyville after all. I try to plan everything out. He said nothing for a moment before turning his head to look at her, a bit of confusion showing on his face.
Everything?
She simply smiled, giving a small wink, and moved forward, letting her lips rest near his ear, and spoke a single word, her soft voice slightly husky. Absolutely everything. He shivered a bit as her warm breath washed over his skin a moment, and decided to let the conversation drop at that, knowing that she was gearing up to tease him further. Together the two danced for several more minutes, until the end of the song, and for a few moments Twilight simply held on to him, enjoying the embrace, finally ending it after a few moments. She smiled up at the man, her cheeks still a bit red, taking a moment to speak. Thank you for the dance, Grevin. He smiled and nodded.
You're welcome, Twilight.
Their conversation wasn't able to last longer than that, however, due to the DJ tapping loudly on a microphone, drawing everyone's attention to her. Alright, everybody, we're at the last dance for the night, so grab that special sun pony and hit that dance floor. Applejack came bounding onto the dance floor, nearly slamming into Twilight, who had already begun to make her way back to the table, where Fluttershy waited with another mug of cider. Grevin didn't miss the small scowl that washed over Twilight's face as she passed her friend, but wasn't able to give it much more thought, due to Applejack standing a few inches away from him, a simple smile on her face. He could tell that she was just as drunk as the others, but she did well at hiding it. Her cheeks were not as rosy, and her eyes were not quite so glossy, however. The goofy smile on her lips gave it away. He held out his hand to her, with his palm facing up. Applejack? She smirked and never moved her eyes from his. Yes, Sugar Cube? He couldn't help but smile a bit at her behavior, shaking his head ever so slightly. Would you like to dance? She grinned and placed a hoof on his hand. I sure would. She rose up shakily on her back legs and leaned forward, letting her forelegs wrap around his neck, moving close enough to let her barrel rest against his chest, while her lips were mere inches from his. Question is, do you think this stubborn farm pony can keep up with you? He smiled and nodded, doing his best to keep from hitting his head against hers. I'm certain you can. You don't back down from any challenge. She simply smiled at this, and moved forward, letting her cheeks brush against his, letting her muzzle find his shoulder. Slowly, she began to sway and move with him as the music began to play, a simple, content smile on her face. For his part, Grevin was honestly a bit surprised by how easy this particular dance was going. Both Fluttershy and Twilight had teased him a bit, but Applejack was content just to be in his arms as they moved to the music. It was a nice change of pace, he had to admit. He could get used to this sort of feeling. He paused for only a moment, making him stumble slightly as he realized what he had just thought. He wasn't supposed to feel comfortable. He wasn't supposed to be relaxed when around females. This wasn't something he was expecting. Applejack caught on to his small stumble, but simply smiled and nuzzled in, letting her lips lightly touch his neck, her warm breath tickling his skin as she spoke. You alright? I'm not throwing you off, am I? I know I'm not very talented when it comes to this kind of dancing. Now square dancing, at a hoedown, there's a dance I'm good at. He quickly shook his head and cleared his throat a bit. No, you're fine. I simply slipped a bit. Sorry. She chuckled a bit. I wouldn't have expected that from a fella that walks on two legs all the time. He smirked and chuckled. You'd be surprised at how often I trip. She simply nodded after a few moments, this content smile on her face beginning to fade, and was replaced by a more nervous look in her eyes. She leaned down
She looked down for a moment before taking a steadying breath.
Graven.
He turned his head slightly, hearing the softer tone in her voice. Yes, Applejack? She looked away a moment, her nerves beginning to get to her.
Well, as nice as it is to be dancing with you like this, I actually wanted to talk to you a little.
He nodded slowly, a small frown coming across his lips upon hearing her hesitation. What about? She hesitated, closing her eyes in frustration. Here she was with someone she felt strongly about, and yet she was hesitating. She mentally kicked herself. Why does she hesitate? She hesitated in the orchard, and now she was doing it again. Why? Was she afraid? She was one of the bravest ponies in Ponyville. Nothing bothered her too much, but yet, this seemed to. Applejack, are you alright? She jerked her head back a bit and nodded.
Oh, yeah, I'm alright.
He turned his head to look into her eyes for a few moments. Then, what did you need to speak to me about? She darted her eyes left and right for a second before closing them and putting a large, sheepish smile on her lips.
Oh, nothing important. I was just thinking about next year's crop, but that can wait till tomorrow.
He paused a moment, watching her carefully before nodding a bit, returning to the soft embrace they were in moments before. Well, if you say so. She closed her eyes, a small hint of a tear running down her left cheek as she nodded.
I too.
Nothing more was said as they finished their dance, and as the music released its last note, they pulled back from one another and joined the rest of the crowd in applauding the DJ. They made their way back to the table, passing several ponies that were heading to the exit. Soon joined Twilight and Fluttershy, who both looked to have enjoyed several more drinks while they were waiting. Fluttershy's face was red and her eyes glossy, while Twilight's was swaying unsteadily, a small smile adorning her lips. Applejack frowned a bit and moved over towards Twilight, her eyes narrowing in concern.
Girls, I think you've had enough to drink.
Fluttershy nodded, taking a second to wink at Greven before she began to giggle in her seat.
I think you may be right.
Greven frowned as well, the memory of walking Twilight home playing through his mind once more. Do you think they can make it home safely, AJ? She shook her head, a small sigh escaping her.
No, well, I'll tell you what. I'll take Twilight home since you did last time, and you can take Fluttershy back to her cottage. It's not too far from Sweet Apple Acres, so you shouldn't have a hard time getting back.
The truth was, she didn't want Twilight trying to pull anything with Greven when she was alone with him. She figured that Fluttershy was too nice a mare to try anything, so he would be fine with her. Greven simply nodded, noting that Twilight had begun to scowl at both her cream-colored friend and the orange farm pony, while Fluttershy had a large smile on her face that nearly made his heart explode with adorableness. Well, all right. You sure you can get Twilight home okay? Applejack smirked and hoisted her friend up onto her back, sending a small wink in his direction.
I'm sure she won't cause me any trouble. I'll see you back at the farm.
He nodded, watching her turn and walk away with Twilight, but his attention was quickly drawn to his side when Fluttershy moved close and leaned against his arm, using him as a support. Fluttershy, are you ready to head home? She smiled and nodded up at him, her wings ruffling slightly, tickling his arm with her feathers.
Yes, I'll try not to slow us down too much.
I'm sure you won't, especially since it's your house. She nodded and began to walk with him out of the town hall with the remaining stragglers of the dance. Fluttershy couldn't help but enjoy the way several ponies would look at the two as they walked past, taking note of some of the more jealous looks she received from some of the mares. She knew that the story of his actions in Canterlot had been spread around town by Pinkie Pie the moment they had returned to Ponyville, and, thanks to the way Pinkie had told the story, Greven had been made out to be something along the lines of a hero of epic proportions, including some parts of him that some mares at the spa had begun to speculate about. The two made their way to the outer edge of Ponyville, heading to the isolated cottage that belonged to the shy mare, the various chicken coops and animal roosts visible in the moonlight. Fluttershy glanced up at Greven for a moment, before lightly clearing her throat.
Please be very quiet until we get into the house. All my little animal friends are sleeping. Even Angel Bunny seems to be asleep in his little house.
She motioned to what appeared to be a miniature house complete with windows and even a wood-shingled roof. Greven quietly nodded and led her up to the steps to her front door, where she seemed to stumble a bit and leaned hard against him. He quickly knelt down and put an arm around the shy mare, his concern showing on his face. "Fluttershy, are you all right?" She nodded after a few moments, looking up at him to smile at him.
You're so nice to walk me home. I think I'm all right. Could you walk me inside though? This dress is getting heavy, and I'm not sure I can get it off without some help.
This made him give a brief pause, a slight frown adorning his lips. She pouted, her lip ever so slightly.
Please, if it's not too much trouble, that is.
He didn't like it, not a bit. It was much too like what happened with Twilight before, but the look in her eyes tugged at his sense of honor. "All right, but only for a few minutes. You need your sleep, and I should get back to Sweet Apple Acres." Fluttershy visibly brightened, her smile beaming as she nodded and moved to open the door, leading them both into the quiet, dark cottage. Once they were both inside, she motioned to Greven to move to the couch in the back of the room, while she turned away for a moment.
Go ahead, have a seat, please.
He moved slowly into the room, taking in just how nice it looked. It was clear she was very cleanly, and liked living in a homey space. He let himself sit down on the couch, noting that it was quite comfortable, and if he were ever to lay on something like it for very long, he would most likely fall asleep. He didn't receive much time to take in his surroundings, however, due to Fluttershy closing the front door, bathing the room in darkness, not giving his eyes time to adjust. Greven waited a moment, thinking that she would light a candle or a lamp of some sort, but after a few seconds he began to worry. "Fluttershy, it's a little dark in here, don't you think?" He heard the sound of her making her way to the couch, a soft clip-clop of her hooves on the floor stopping just in front of him.
Oh, well, I was actually hoping we could keep the lights off. You see, I'm not used to getting help with taking off clothes, and I'm a little nervous. I can turn on a light if you want, though.
He paused a moment and lightly shook his head. "No, that's all right. I'll manage. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable." He could swear he heard her grinning as he said that.
All right, well, if you could please undo the zipper on my back, I can probably get the rest of the costume off.
She came into view just in front of him, her face a few inches from his before turning to present her side to him, her wings fluttering a bit. Greven reached out and ran his hands over her back in an attempt to find the zipper, his fingers brushing between her wings, earning a small gasp from her as she arched her back a bit, pressing into his touch. He paused a moment, his palm resting between her wings, concern showing on his face as he felt her shiver under his touch. "Fluttershy, are you all right?" She took a shaky breath and nodded, her cheeks flushed a bit.
Yes, please continue. I think the zipper is in the middle of my costume up by my neck.
He paused a moment before sliding his hand up her back, a look of concern in his eyes. After a few moments of fumbling around the fabric, he did indeed find a zipper, and managed to pull it back down to her tail, letting the fabric fall to the ground with a soft thump, leaving only the remaining sign of her costume to be the bits of leaves in her tousled hair. She turned to face him, her face shifting into a sly smile, her hair covering one of her eyes as she stared up at him with an expression which caused him to feel a sudden chill run up his spine. Fluttershy took a step forward, placing a hoof next to her leg, propping herself up so her face was closer to his.
Grevin, can I ask for another favor?
Grevin pulled away as best he could, his back pressing it into the back cushion of the couch, the alcohol and her breath washing over his face. What is it, Fluttershy? She looked down a moment before slowly stretching out her wings.
Well, could you rub my wings? Being in the costume made them feel a bit sore. I think your hands would be perfect to help work out some of the tension. If you don't mind, that is.
She looked back up at him, her cheeks flushed a solid hue of red. Well, all right, but then I need to go. His instincts were telling him to get out of the room, but he didn't want to make her go through any pain either, so he pushed his gut feelings down and ignored them for the time being. She grinned and hopped down, turning around to sit between his legs, her back facing him, her tail flicking with anticipation.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
He popped his knuckles a moment before reaching down and slowly starting to rub her back, letting his fingers slide firmly over her shoulders and neck, earning a soft sigh from her. Slowly he slid his hands down inch by inch, taking his time to work out any tension he happened to come across for a few minutes. However, the moment he placed his fingers between her wings, she lightly gasped and pressed herself against him, her form shivering at his touch, and her wings flared out, flapping slightly with a soft pomp.
Oh, that feels good.
He pulled his hands back a moment, earning a small whimper from the mare as she squirmed in front of him. Are you all right? She said nothing for a moment, the only sound being the soft panting escaping her lips. She looked over her shoulder and looked at him with half-lidded eyes.
Oh, yes, I'm all right. Please, don't stop now.
Well, all right. He reached forward once more and began to gently knead the edges of her wings, starting at the tip and making his way to the center, doing his best to be gentle with them. Fluttershy did little to help him, though, shivering and moaning softly at his actions, making him think he was doing more harm than good. After a few minutes, Grevin found that Fluttershy was beginning to lean forward, forcing him to move with her, stretching to keep working the tension from her form until something caught his attention. It was subtle at first, a simple small scent that wafted across his nose. But the more she moved forward, the more she would slowly raise her back legs up, and the stronger the scent became. Grevin quickly pulled back as the scent grew strong enough to make him uncomfortable, which forced the mare to shakily take a few steps forward. She shook her head, pulling her senses together, and quickly turned to face him. For a few moments she said nothing, and stared at him, her mane still covering her face a bit, while the look on her face conveyed a very simple message to him. He was her prey now. Fluttershy quickly lunged forward with a powerful flap of her wings, and reared up, putting her hooves around his shoulders, while knocking him back against the couch. She moved her face centimeters from his, her lips dangerously close. She stared into his eyes, and slowly began to close the gap between them, a single whisper escaping her lips before connecting with him, and a gentle but passionate kiss.
Grevin.
For a moment he sat there, stunned, his eyes wide in surprise. He quickly pulled back from her, breaking the kiss, and closed his eyes, turning away slightly, while his own cheeks burned a fierce red. Fluttershy. That... I should probably... She shook her head, letting her mane brush against his face, stopping him mid-sentence.
No, wait. It was just your hands. It felt so good to have you rub my wings. It was amazing, and I couldn't stop myself. I'm sorry.
She glanced down at his chest, and then to his shoulders where the chest plate was fastened.
I just wanted to talk to you.
She slowly leaned her head forward, letting her lips brush over one of the buckles holding the armor in place. He wasn't uncomfortable. It was clear she was still pretty drunk, and now he had somehow managed to get her horny. He needed to leave, now. Look, it's alright, but we can sort this out tomorrow. She frowned and pressed harder against him, moving so she was nearly sitting in his lap, her tail flicking side to side in worry, the soft hairs brushing across his pant legs.
No, Grevin, I just wanted to tell you something. Please let me.
He sighed and tried to ignore the heat that he could feel against his legs coming from her, his own body beginning to betray his thoughts, and a familiar sensation beginning to make itself known from his groin. All right, what did you want to say? She smiled and moved forward, quickly taking a buckle in between her teeth and pulling it so it would release, using her forehoofs to press his arms down when they rose up to stop her. She turned her head and brushed her lips over his jaw and nibbled up it till she came back to his face. In her mind, she was having a small conflict. She knew what she was doing was wrong, that she was moving too quickly. She knew this would probably make him uncomfortable and probably drive him away, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. It was almost as though she wasn't in control of her own body. She would have deemed it a dream if it wasn't for the fact that her body, even her nethers, seemed to be burning with desire for him, for his touch.
Grevin, ever since you saved my life, I've been thinking about you, in many, many different ways.
Fluttershy, perhaps you should wait until... He frowned once more and tried to raise his hands up, only to have her push them down once more. He heard her growl, and she stomped down once more onto his arms, sending a small bit of pain through them, causing him to stop mid-sentence.
No, listen to me, please. I have feelings for you, strong ones. When you healed me with your magic, filled me with such warmth, I had never felt anything like it before, not even with the elements of harmony. It was so intense, so strong, but it felt so right. I think it was just after that I developed a small crush on you. Then you showed that us all such kindness and bravery in the past several weeks that I couldn't help but find you to be someone quite special. Someone I wanted more than just as a friend. Someone I liked more than just a simple crush.
His breathing stopped. His eyes opened in shock, and he slowly turned his head to face her, the surprise showing on his face. Fluttershy simply smiled and darted forward to his other shoulder, undoing another buckle as quickly as the first. With that done, she pulled back just enough to grab hold of the chest plate with her mouth and hooves, to pull it from him and throw it to the ground next to the couch, with a solid thud. Grevin shook his head in disbelief. He knew what Cadence and the others had told him that some ponies held an interest in him, but he wasn't expecting such forward actions, especially from Fluttershy of all mares. Perhaps the old saying was true. It was the quiet ones that truly can get wild. Still, this felt wrong, and he needed to stop it before things got out of hand. His thoughts were interrupted by the feeling of his chest plate being pulled off of him, followed by the sound of it hitting the floor. He blinked a few moments, clearing his vision to find that Fluttershy had managed to push him to one side, with enough force to lay him back a bit on the couch. He quickly reached out and grabbed her shoulders, trying to push her back. Fluttershy, you've had too much to drink, and you're not thinking clearly. She simply smiled down at him and pressed forward, letting her hips slowly slide until they rested above his, the heat from her sex now resting directly over his covered but hardening member, pressing down against him, sending just enough sensation through him to force him to close his eyes and grit his teeth. She leaned down and brushed her lips over his in a soft, giant-like kiss, her breath washing over his face.
Grevin, I don't think I've ever been so certain of something in my life. I can't help myself. I know you may not be all that comfortable with this, but if you give it a chance, give me a chance.
Grevin frowned and began to gently push her back, while doing his best to sit upright, attempting to get her out of the awkward position. I think it would be best to wait till morning before acting on your feelings, Fluttershy. You're drunk, I'm a bit tipsy. Let's not do anything rash. Fluttershy frowned as she noticed that he wasn't using his full strength to move her. He was trying to be gentle with her. She smiled down at him and forcefully began to flap her wings, forcing her to slip out of his grip and slam into him, knocking him back once more.
No, not yet. Please? Let me do this. Let me show you how I feel.
She placed her hooves around his neck and leaned down, her eyes closing as she moved in for another kiss. Grevin scowled as the scene seemed to shift in slow motion as she moved in for the kiss. He didn't want to be in this situation. He knew that she wasn't in her right mind, and it was the alcohol affecting her. He had done his best to put up with these situations for the most of the night, but he was at his limit. He had had enough. He reached up and firmly took hold of her shoulders once more, his grip much stronger than before, causing her eyes to open, a look of confusion washing over her features. He was scowling now, a small growl escaping his lips as he sat up and pushed her back onto the far side of the couch. Enough! The timid mare quickly scooted back, her eyes wide in surprise and fear, watching him as he slowly rose to his feet, seeming to tower over her.
Grevin?
He clenched a fist at his side as he slowly took a steadying breath, closing his eyes as he turned away from her. Fluttershy, I appreciate that you like me, but you've had a lot to drink, and I think you're trying to do something that you would end up regretting. She took a shaky breath, her mane washing over her shoulders as she shook her head, her eyes beginning to well up with tears.
No, I wouldn't. I'd never regret do anything with you.
He frowned and turned, picking up his armor off the ground, giving Fluttershy the time to flap her wings and rise into the air so she could be at eye level with him. She quickly moved in front of him and held out her forelegs in front of him to keep him from passing by her for a moment. Her cyan eyes locked onto his, silently pleading with him.
Wait, please, don't go.
He said nothing as he stood before her, holding his chest plate in his hand, his face hardened and his eyes looking into hers without emotion. He had gone back into his shell. Fluttershy, I need to leave before we end up doing something we might regret. You're a good mare, you're beautiful, and I admit I feel some attraction, but I'm not someone you want to have a relationship with. I'm damaged goods. She looked down as she lowered down to the floor, tears falling from her eyes, rolling down her cheeks, a simple phrase coming from her lips in a faint whisper.
You're wrong. So wrong.
He moved a step around her, only for her to stick out her hoof, tripping him, causing him to fall to the floor, discarding his armor to the side. He grunted as he pushed himself over onto his back, and sat up, gritting his teeth. What are you doing? Fluttershy moved faster than he had ever seen her move before, flapping her wings to put herself swiftly into the air. She maneuvered herself so she floated a foot above him, staring down at him with teary eyes, her face showing a deep level of pain. However, there was another emotion beginning to show itself. There was anger in her eyes.
How dare you?
He shook his head, trying to ignore her, and began to push himself up, only for her to let herself drop down onto his chest, knocking the wind from him, slamming him back to the floor. She narrowed her eyes and leaned in close, her eyes boring into his.
How dare you?
He began to open his mouth as he tried to once again sit up. Fluttershy. However, the moment he spoke, he felt a soft hoof jammed hard into his mouth, forcing his head to slam back into the floor once more.
No, you're going to listen, and you're going to listen good, mister. You put yourself down and call yourself unlovable, damaged, dangerous, and yet you have proven that wrong nearly on a daily basis. You think you should be hated, loathed, and feared? Well, guess what? You have only given me and others reasons to like you, love you as a friend, or something more.
She spoke. She moved closer and closer until he could feel her breath wash across his face, with every syllable spoken, her cyan eyes softening with each sentence.
I think you're scared, afraid to open your heart to us, to me, but I want to show you that you can let us in. Just give me a chance to show you.
She moved closer, resting her body on him now, her eyes beginning to close as she pulled her hoof back from his lips.
Just this once, please.
She leaned forward and pressed her lips against his in a fierce kiss, a sigh escaping her as she slid her hooves around his neck. Griffin froze as she pressed into him, her soft lips against his parting slightly, hoping to coax him to do the same. He could feel her pressing her entire form against him, her soft fur inviting him with its warmth, her wings fluttering above him, seeming to shiver with passion. He could feel himself beginning to relax against her, letting her get closer, letting her break down his barriers. He tried to turn his head to the side, but that only encouraged her to press closer. Fluttershy let out a soft moan against his lips as she parted hers, her tongue darting forward, trying to gain access to his mouth. She slowly moved her body against him, letting her haunches press down against him just enough to earn a small groan from his throat, making her cheer inwardly. Griffin tried to resist. He tried to pull away, but he couldn't. He felt his eyes close as his arms moved, almost against his will, slowly wrapping their way around her shoulders, pulling her down against him, his lips parting just enough to let her dart her tongue over his teeth, making her moan louder. Fluttershy pulled her head back slightly, taking only a moment to break the kiss, allowing a shaky breath to escape her. She could feel her body moving on instinct, pressing her haunches down against him, a tingling sensation between her legs making itself known once again. Rather than fight the sensation, she welcomed it and dove back down, capturing his lips in hers once more, a soft whimper escaping her. Griffin felt himself inadvertently press his hips up against hers, his members straining against his pants as she squirmed and pressed against him, a small growl echoing from his throat, which seemed to excite the mare even further. He slid his hands down her back toward her wings, causing her to arch against his touch, her tail flicking back and forth, brushing over again and again. Fluttershy broke the kiss once more, pulling back a bit to look down at him, a soft, sultry smile on her lips, her eyes half-lidded, looking at him through her now mussed mane, a small sigh escaping her.
Oh my, I had no idea you were such a good kisser.
He glanced away, stunned, finding that her gaze made him slightly uncomfortable while he cleared his throat. Well, thank you, I suppose. I'm not used to that sort of thing. Fluttershy simply grinned and nuzzled his cheek as she again pressed her warm form against him. once more, her hoof slowly beginning to slide down his arm and to his hip and thigh.
Well, that's alright. We, could do more than that. Or something else. If you want to, that is.
Griffin frowned and pulled his hands out from under her and pushed her back while trying to sit up, a look of confusion forming on her face.
Griffin?
He didn't meet her gaze as he turned away from her, not answering as he reached out to pick up his chest plate and began to reattach it to the rest of his armor. Fluttershy reached out, placing a soft hoof on his shoulder, only to have him shrug it off while shaking his head.
Griffin, what's wrong? Did I push too much? I'm sorry.
He sighed and turned to face her, taking her hoof in his hands, holding it gently. No, you're okay, but Fluttershy, I can't. It felt good, even natural, but... She leaned forward as she bit her bottom lip, tears threatening to fall from her eyes once more.
But what's wrong? Why do you hold back?
He turned away, letting her hoof go as he quickly rose to his feet and began to move to the door, leaving her there in the shadows. I don't know. It's hard to explain. I need to go. I'm sorry. Please, find it in your heart to forgive me. With that, he gave her no chance to reply, and opened the door, stepping out in the night, leaving her sitting in the dark, stunned, silence that lasted several moments before her tears began to fall. Perspective change. Chrysalis smirked as she moved closer to the apple orchard next to the Everfree forest, two of her remaining brood trailing just behind her, awaiting their instructions. She had used the time her prey was dancing at the party to find the mayor of Ponyville and use her magic to force her to not only provide her with a vacant home to move into, but also access to a small slush fund of bits from the city budget. Now she had a place to live to keep up her facade, as well as a location for the next step of her plan, which also involved the fodder following her through the field. She had also managed to gather some information from the locals regarding the man who she was stalking. Apparently he was a visitor from another world, who she learned was named Grevin, was pulled here by a powerful magic that not even Princess Celestia could find a way to send him back. He took a long time to adjust to pony society, avoiding contact with the locals until he had a welcoming party, which was held by the pink annoyance known as Pinkie Pie. Once he had relaxed enough, he was graced with an invitation to Canterlot, where he had managed to unleash discord, and also unleash a monster upon the populace there. A small scowl washed across her face as she learned that instead of the capital being destroyed, Grevin had managed to fight off the threat when the danger had passed. He was also given the position of knight by Celestia, which is no small feat. She slowed her walking as she approached the edge of the forest, knowing that her prey would have to approach fairly close by in order to get home, which gave her the perfect opportunity to spring her small trap. She turned to face the two drones behind her and smirked, her eyes glinting in the moonlight.
All right, when I tell you, you will begin to chase me with the intent to draw blood and cause harm. This must be convincing. If you hesitate, I will kill you myself. Draw blood if you must. I will run to my unsuspecting prey and play the part of innocent lost man who will want to have an escort home. Once he leaves, the rest of the brood will take their hidden forms and infiltrate the town and wait for my orders. Is that clear?
She didn't wait for a response as she turned around once more and began to search for her target, her magic washing out around her, looking for any sort of feeling that could be coming from him. Within moments she began to sense something, but it wasn't what she was expecting. Instead of confidence or even residual lust from his time with the annoyingly kind mare, she sensed confusion, frustration, nervousness, nothing that a bold warrior should be feeling.
Perhaps she had honed in on the wrong individual, so she tried to search the area once more, frowning as she again honed in on the same feelings. She sighed and glanced over her shoulder. Well, perhaps he simply needs to find something to focus on. Let's draw the fly into our web. Perspective change. Grevin slowed his pace as he made his way through the edge of the forest, making his way towards the back of Sweet Apple Acres, his mind racing with what had just occurred moments before. Fluttershy, the meek, kind-hearted, good-as-gold mare had just confessed feelings for him, teased him, kissed him, and even hinted at moving things to a further level. He knew that some ponies cared for him, but he didn't expect things to reach that level, ever. Normally in Bastion, he wouldn't have to worry about such things for various reasons, mostly of which came from his intimidating presence while in his cloak, and for the more persistent people, his face. He never let anyone get close, but now, thanks to the girls, he had let his guard down, and they were making him feel things that he hadn't dealt with in many years. He was at odds with himself. Part of him wanted to let the mares have their way, to give in to desire, and want to return the feelings they had. Another part of him told him to shield himself from any potential heartbreak, and simply pull back into his shell, cutting off nearly all ties with the girls. He struggled to sort out the various emotions swirling around in his head and heart. He felt nervous, more so than he had in a very long time, ever since his last bout with love. He felt anger in two forms, the first from the memory of the betrayal he endured when he was younger, and the second at himself for how he left Fluttershy in tears back in her home. He shouldn't have run out on her the way he did. He would have to find a way to apologize later, if she would even want to see him at that point. He sighed and made his way over to the nearby tree, and leaned back against it, crossing his arms as he let his eyes focus on his feet. So what was he going to do? There seemed to be an ever-growing number of mares becoming fond of him, some to the point that they wouldn't mind making things somewhat physical, which is a whole can of worms in itself. Luna had blatantly flirted with him. Fluttershy had kissed him and even tried to take things to a higher level, and he knew that Twilight and Applejack at least liked him somewhat. How did this even happen? How had he managed to shift from being an outcast to suddenly being something so desirable? It made no sense to him, but here he was with a clear problem. First, did he want to attempt having a relationship here in Equestria? And second, if he did decide he wanted to, who would he be with? If he decided to try having a relationship, he would end up hurting someone when he didn't choose them. But likewise, he would end up hurting them all if he decided to remain solitary. He didn't wish to cause any grief, but he also wasn't certain that he wanted to have a relationship. Perhaps he would be better off on his own. The mares would all eventually find another pony to become interested in, wouldn't they? After all, he isn't even their species. Not only that, not that that ever caused a problem in Bastion, but here it could be complicated. His thoughts were interrupted by a shrill, blood-chilling scream in the distance, causing his eyes to widen while snapping to attention, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword, which wasn't there. He grimaced at his own stupidity for thinking he'd better go to Nightmare Night unarmed as the scream sounded once again. It sounded like it was close, and it sounded like a mare.
Help, help!
He wasted no time and surged forward, breaking into a run, his training kicking in, pushing his thoughts to the back of his mind, focusing on the task at hand. He ran through the brush and trees as fast as his legs would take him, his eyes searching for the source of the voice calling for help. His mind raced with worry, knowing that he was near the back edge of Sweet Apple Acres, and that the one in trouble could easily be Applejack, or even Applebloom and her friends. He narrowed his eyes as he felt a small surge of anger wash over him. If any harm were to come to his friends or their family, there would be hell to pay for whoever it was responsible. A very slow, painful version of hell. Help! He focused his thoughts to the matter at hand and pushed himself harder, putting more effort from his legs. He ducked under a thick branch and crashed through some bushes, doing his best to keep his balance as he continued to run. After a few moments, he began to see movement in the distance. He did his best to focus on he was approaching, and what he saw was something more like what he would expect to see in Bastion, not Equestria. Several yards ahead, running across a small clearing, was a green unicorn mare. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears rolling down her cheeks, her mouth open as she gasped for breath. Behind her was what Grevin could only describe as a large pony-like insect. They had what appeared to be carapaces instead of a fur coat, bug eyes, a horn, insect wings, and what caught his attention most of all were their fangs, which appeared to be dripping with some sort of greenish saliva, possibly a venom of some sort. He had fought large insect creatures back home, but nothing quite like this before. He quickly raised a hand, trying to gain the attention of the mare. "Over here! Get behind me!" He saw her lock eyes with him, and in an instant she shifted into a hard run, galloping as fast as she could, making a beeline for him, a glimmer of hope beginning to show on her face. But sadly for her, her attackers were able to turn faster than she could, and one leaped through the air, tackling her to the earth, causing the two to tumble roughly on the ground for several feet, stopping in a small pile approximately 40 yards from Grevin. The second attacker wasted no time in taking advantage of the mare's tumble and confusion, and quickly leapt onto her, pushing her down, making her shriek in terror. "Ah! Help me! Stop! Ah!" The creature had cut her, screaming short by leaning down and firmly biting down on her foreleg, its teeth piercing the skin, spilling blood over its muzzle and her coat. The mare struggled to pull her leg free, only to cause the flesh to tear from her, making her cry out in agony, her eyes turning now to look at Grevin, who was now within 15 yards of her, pleading with him to silently help her, to save her from death. Grevin felt his anger swell from deep inside, a growl escaping him as he grit his teeth, his hands clenching as something in his mind snapped. A flashback to the mare in Canterlot washed through his mind, the image of blood pooling around her, making his blood boil. He wouldn't let it happen again, not if he could do anything about it. He began to shift his position, pulling his shoulder down a bit, angling himself at his target. He never even considered getting his dagger out from its sheath. No, this was the perfect moment for a little hands-on practice. "Let her go," he bellowed as he narrowed the gap, causing the creature to release its bite and raise its muzzle, licking the blood from its lips before hissing and baring its fangs at him. Grevin smirked and lunged with a final push of his legs, launching himself in an arch over the mare, slamming himself into the creature and off the mare, sending the two tumbling several feet in a grunting, hissing mass of punching and biting. Grevin ended up on his back with the creature atop him, hissing and snapping its jaws at his neck, his forearm pressing against its neck, holding it back as it thrashed against him, its fangs inches from his throat, its foul breath nearly making him retch. Grevin quickly pulled back his right arm and drove his fist into one of the creature's eyes, blinding it momentarily, causing it to pull back as it screeched in pain, lashing out with its two hooves, catching one across his face, the sharp shell of its legs cutting his flesh just above his eyes, washing his vision in crimson. He pulled his left hand back, trying to wipe the blood from his eyes, giving the creature time to press its attack once more. It used its free hoof to smack his arm to the side, and proceed to strike at his chest and face multiple times, its confidence growing every time it managed to earn more blood from its current foe, who was now covered with it from his face to his hands. Grevin grunted as he did his best to keep his eyes covered from the creature's assault, a thud of hoof strikes against his chest armor. This creature was stronger than he realized, and he was quite thankful for his armor now. Otherwise he would be covered in far more cuts and possibly deeper wounds. He knew he needed to end things quickly though, and check on that mare and her wound. She could be bleeding out or near death thanks to the wound she had received. He quickly threw out both his arms, knocking the creature from his chest and onto its back, and used the momentum to roll to his side and quickly move up to his feet, turning to face the creature once more. The bug-like pony had already sprung back to its hooves and was beginning to circle around Grevin, its wings buzzing with anticipation. Grevin smirked as he felt a small stream of blood flow down his left cheek to his neck. He popped his neck twice as he shifted his shoulders, preparing for another assault.
Is that all you've got?
The creature hissed, narrowing its eyes as a greenish hue began to form around its horn, growing in intensity every second, until a burst of fiery green energy shot forth, catching Grevin square on his chest, throwing him back several feet in an uncontrolled spin, forcing him to land hard on his arm and side. The creature chittered out some sort of laugh as it broke into a run, ready to pounce on his chest. Grevin felt his chest as though he had been hit by a cart full of dwarves, or perhaps Pinkie Pie after several milkshakes. He growled and forced himself to sit up.
Nice one,
He frowned, noticing that the creature was charging now, its horn lowered, ready to try and skewer him. A sly grin grew on his lips as he quickly shifted into a kneeling position and pulled back his hand, clenching it into a tight fist. He waited for just the right moment, and just as the creature was upon him, he drove his fist upward, ducking it under the sharp horn to its neck, where it latched on with a firm grip, and quickly rolled, using the monster's momentum to flip it onto its back, pinning it to the damp earth. Grevin moved over the thrashing form of the being and tightened his grip, causing the exoskeleton to crack under the pressure. He used his free hand to latch onto the creature's muzzle and quickly began to pry it open against its will. Perspective change. Chrysalis could only stare in awe as she watched the ongoing fight. She had done her best to maintain her scared facade, but it was difficult considering just how this battle was progressing. For a moment she had thought this knight was being put on some sort of pedestal by the various ponies simply because he was so well built. But as the fight continued, she saw something that caught her off guard. He was taking a beating that would normally cause any other pony to submit or suffer even further severe injury, and he was coming back for more. Now he had her drone on its back, and the look on his face was that of someone who was about to show no mercy. It was thrilling. She watched as he pried open the drone's muzzle and began to pry it back against its will, the gurgling sounds escaping its throat, music to her ears. She watched with fascination as he continued to pull the mouth open, the sound of tearing flesh and bone beginning to fill the air, as the drone's gurgling turned to cries of pain as its mouth was forced past its normal hinge point. An evil grin came across her face as she watched the man growl and forcefully pull the drone's head apart at the jawline with a sickening ripping sound. Green blood spurted everywhere, coating the man's armored hands while he tossed aside the drone's face, the body under him ceasing all movement. She waited and watched nervously as the man slowed his breathing and began to wipe his hands off on the grass before rising to his feet and slowly making his way to her. Her smirk faded, replaced by nervousness as he approached. Slowly she scooted back away from him, partially to appear afraid of him, but also because her confidence was beginning to wane as he moved closer and closer. She hoped that her disguise was holding as he knelt down before her and slowly spread his arms to his side in a peaceful gesture.
I'm sorry if I frightened you. My name is Grevin. I truly mean you no harm. You're hurt. Is it bad? Can I help you?
She paused and carefully watched him before slowly nodding.
Yes, my leg. I've been bitten. I was trying to get back to my home in Ponyville and I was attacked. I was so scared.
She flashed him her best tear-filled look and trembled for extra effect.
I thought I was going to.
He held up his hands and shook his head.
It's all right. You're safe now. I'm not going to let any harm come to you.
She shakily nodded and looked
out towards the dim lights of Ponyville before trying to turn over and rise to her hooves. Her motion, though, was stopped by a firm but gentle hand on her side, keeping her on her back. She turned back to face the man and noticed his eyes were focused on her leg wound.
What is it?
He frowned a bit and began to remove one of his gloves. Your leg wound looks bad. I can take you back to Ponyville Hospital if you want. Or I can take care of it when you get home. Either way, you'll be safe. Chrysalis mentally frowned, knowing the choice was clear. If she were to be taken to the hospital, there would be a high risk of her being discovered there. No, she needed to be taken back to her home in Ponyville. She took a shaky breath, doing her best to sound like she was still very shaken, and nodded.
Please, help me get back home? I just want this night to be over. I don't want to go to the hospital. How can you help me, though?
She watched as he simply smiled and closed his eyes, while resting one arm on his knee and held out his uncovered hand. For a few moments nothing happened, and she began to think he had taken too many blows to the head. But then she felt it. It was subtle at first, like it was being drawn from deep within his core, but then it came rushing forward like a controlled flood of raw power. Magic, unlike any she had felt before, even when she battled Princess Celestia. She watched him shift in concentration, and then to her surprise, his magic began to manifest at his fingertips. It was hard to see at first, but as he continued to draw on his magic from within, it grew. Soon it looked something akin to a blue mist-like fire that seemed to flow and envelop his hand, but she could feel no heat from it, and if it caused him any pain, he didn't show it. She couldn't take her eyes off of it. The way it moved around his fingertips was mesmerizing. It was as though it were alive.
It's beautiful.
She heard him chuckle a bit before shaking his head. Normally when I do this I'm looked at as some sort of monster, but here in Equestria none of the ponies seem to fear it. I'm glad for that. Now hold still. I'm going to begin. Chrysalis simply nodded as though he could see her through his closed eyes, and watched as he lowered his now glowing hand toward her leg. Time seemed to slow down as his palm moved closer to the wound, nearly freezing when it was about to connect. But then they touched, and she felt a sensation unlike any she had felt before. The changeling queen clenched her eyes shut, and was forced to focus all her concentration on holding her form due to the surge of sensation washing over her and through her entire being. She felt an incredibly pleasurable warmth pulse through her, making all her muscles relax, yet tense at the same time. She bit down on her lip as the sensations continued to make their way through her, a small moan escaping her as she felt it wash over her plot and nether region, sending waves of pleasure through her, shaking her to the core. She hadn't been expecting anything like this, not at all. She could feel herself pant ever so slightly before she managed to regain enough of her senses to open one of her eyes and look down at his leg wound, and what she saw nearly made her jaw drop, causing all her focus on the sensations washing through her to be pushed to the back of her mind. Through the blue mist of his magic, she could see that the bleeding wound was beginning to mend at an incredible rate. Magic seemed to pulse around it, keeping it from bleeding and then closing the skin back around it in an accelerated healing rate unlike any magic she had seen in her travels. Certainly she had seen healing magic before, but nothing that appeared as this did, nor anything that felt as amazing as this did. She closed her eyes once more, allowing a sigh to escape her as she let the man do his task. Within a few moments, the sensation ceased, causing her to open her groggily eyes once more. She watched silently as he pulled back and began to pull his glove back over his hand, a small glint of crimson showing briefly on his skin before covering it once more. Once the glove was in place, she watched him rise to his feet and nod to her with a small smile. There, good as new. Now I'm going to make sure you get home safely, so let's get moving. She blinked a moment before nodding and quickly hopping up to her hose.
Yes, it's this way.
She quietly led him towards the quiet village, moving just in front of him, the only sound being his footsteps and her hoofballs. She found that as they went, her curiosity about this creature was growing faster than she had anticipated, and she needed to know more about him.
So, you said your name was Grevin, is that right?
Yes, Grevin. Hades, though I imagine you would already know that. Her breath caught in her throat. Did he already know who she was, and that she was here because of him?
I should?
Yes, after all, Pinkie Pie threw that massive welcome to Ponyville party for me several weeks back. I thought most of the ponies in town were there. She mentally sighed in relief, as a small smile graced her lips.
No, I moved here from Trottingham only recently. I had heard about a great warrior in town, but nothing in great detail. Though I am quite thankful for you stumbling upon me when you did.
I just happened to be in the area. I'm glad I was able to help, and I'm sorry if I frightened you in that fight. Well, let's just say I'm determined to keep ponies as safe as I can. She nodded as they came into the village's main road.
I understand entirely. I'm just sorry that the other one got away. I have to ask you, though, that magic, the one you used to heal my leg, I've never seen anything like it. What is it?
He cleared his throat a bit while looking away. Well, it's magic that comes from my bloodline. It allows me to take on the wounds of others, healing them while I take on some form of wound that matches theirs. I heal more quickly than most, so it tends not to be an issue. She smiled, glancing back at him over her shoulder.
That's amazing. I bet you have done a lot of good with that magic. You must be very popular.
He nearly tripped at her words, but quickly recovered. Well, no, not exactly. Here it has come in handy, but where I come from, I was seen more as a monster despite the good I did. As for me being popular, well, I do have friends, but I'm by no means the most popular being in the land. Chrysalis perked an eyebrow, her attention focusing on a specific part of his speech. He was seen as a monster. Him? That seems impossible. The one who was taken in by the elements of harmony, the savior of Canterlot, was once seen as a monster. No, it couldn't be. Once you are seen as a monster, you are always seen as a monster. There is no changing that. She was pulled out of her thoughts as she came up to a quaint little cottage in the middle of the village, a simple candle lantern hanging outside the door, lighting the stone path in a simple glow. She moved up to the front and turned to thank him, doing her best to keep her gaze down and appear nervous.
This is it. Thank you for saving me. Would you like to come in? I have tea.
He gently shook his head as he took a small step back, a nervous smile on his face. No, thank you. It's very late, and I'm sure you're wanting to recover from your ordeal. She nodded, putting on her best sad frown, and backed away slightly.
Well, all right.
She paused and quickly moved forward, raising onto her rear legs so she could rest her front hooves on his shoulder and chest.
Well, will I see you again? In town, I mean.
She batted her doe-like eyes, doing her best to tug at his heartstrings, and to her joy, he developed a small blush on his cheeks. He took a small step back from her, but she stayed with him, keeping her hooves on his shoulders. Yes, I'll be around town from time to time. I'm sure you'll see me again.
All right. Well, thank you again.
She leaned forward once more, moving faster than he had expected, planting a small kiss on her cheek before quickly backing away and running into her house, shutting the door abruptly behind her. She smirked as she rested her back against the door, listening to him slowly walk away, his footsteps fading into the night. She knew that she had planted a small seed tonight, and given time, she would be able to make that seed grow and envelop his heart. Everything was going according to plan. Now she just had to make certain to steer clear of those annoying elements of harmony. She had to admit, though, for a night, he was actually fairly nice and gentle-hearted, not something that she expected, and she almost felt bad about including him in her plans. Almost. Perspective change. Grevin shook his head as he made his way through the middle of Ponyville, doing his best to put his thoughts in order. His cheek was still warm from the lips of Emerald and the surprising kiss he had received. He glanced down at his armor, frowning at the small splatters of blood that speckled over it, the remains of his latest altercation causing him to mentally kick himself for his actions. He didn't have to be so brutal, so ruthless. It worried him, to be honest. It made him worry that he was reverting back to his old ways. He closed his eyes and took a shaky breath, reminding himself that he had at least acted with good intentions, and if he hadn't stepped in, that mare would be dead, though that didn't quell his concern much. He opened his eyes and focused his attention to the current task at hand, finding Twilight so he could send a message to the princesses. They needed to be made aware of the creatures he had encountered, and he needed to know if they had any important information regarding them. He wanted to make certain he did what he could to ensure the safety of his friends and his village. He looked down at his blood-covered gloves and sighed, closing his eyes once more as he let them rest at his side once again. He would also need to tell the princesses how he killed the creature with his bare hands, and hope they wouldn't see him as a monster for it. After a few minutes of walking, the library finally came into view, and he noticed that while most of the windows were dark, there was still a faint light in a lone window near the balcony, its glow flickering as though it were light from a candle's flame. He made his way to the door and hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should wait till morning, if Twilight would be asleep at this point, but he knew that she would appreciate him coming with the news sooner rather than later. He knocked quietly at first, but after a few moments of no sound, he knocked louder, only to hear a small grumble from inside and the sound of hoofsteps coming down the sump stairs.
Whoever it is, the library is closed for another 8 hours. If you have late books to return, come back then.
Twilight, it's me. Let me in. The hoofsteps stopped immediately, and there was a brief pause before the sound of rushed movement echoed through the door. He could hear nervous movements and mumbling for a few moments before it finally settled, and the door opened, revealing Twilight still in a majority of her costume, smiling softly at him.
I'm sorry for the wait. Please come in. What happened to you?
Her eyes settled on the blood that stained his armor and the tired look in his eyes, her own face showing great concern as she stepped back and motioned for him to come inside.
Are you all right? What happened? Come in here and get out of that armor.
Grevin stepped in, ducking under the doorframe. As he did, he began to remove his gloves and gauntlets. Twilight closed the door and moved around him, her eyes darting over each piece of exposed skin, checking to see if he was hurt in any way. Noting of only a small cut on his wrist and what appeared to be healing cuts on his face.
What happened to you? Why is there blood on your armor?
He sighed as he placed the last piece of his armor in a small pile near the stairs, leaving him in a pair of light trousers and a simple shirt. I had just finished taking Fluttershy back home, and I was making my way to the barn back at Sweet Apple Acres, when I heard someone screaming. I wasn't going to allow a repeat of what happened in Canterlot, so I ran as fast as I could towards it. What I found was something I didn't expect. I found a unicorn being chased by these insect-like pony creatures. They had horns, insect-like wings, bug-like eyes, and the skin was similar to the shells of an insect. He made his way past Twilight and motioned to the couch. "May I?" She simply nodded, moving to sit next to him as he seated himself before continuing. She had a small fear growing within her, but she wanted to wait for him to finish his story before she said anything. "Thank you. Well, I wasn't able to get to the mare before harm was done. One of the creatures managed to tackle her and injure her before I could reach them. After that happened, I saw red, and what I did next, I'm not exactly proud of." Twilight placed a hoof on his arm and looked into his eyes, saying nothing for a moment.
Grevin, whatever happened, I still trust you, so please talk to me.
He nodded quietly, averting his gaze as he took a slow, shaky breath. "Oh, well, I had a single weapon on me, but I decided to use my bare hands. Well, I removed the creature from the pony as we fought. It managed to land a few blows on my face. It wasn't a long fight, and I ended up killing it with my bare hands. But that isn't what upsets me. I'll talk about that in a moment. While we fought, the other creature got away, and afterward I healed the mare and escorted her back home. I then came here directly to inform you so you could write a letter to the princesses." Twilight frowned as she wrote, a small look of concern growing in her eyes.
Grevin, it sounds like the creatures you described are changelings. There have been some reports of them appearing from time to time ever since the battle during Cadence and Shining's royal wedding. If they are here in Ponyville, then we should be worried. But I'll have to wait to jump to conclusions until I hear back from Princess Celestia. Now that I've gotten all that written down, can you tell me what it is that seems to be bothering you?
He closed his eyes and clasped his hands together in a fist, resting his chin on it for a moment. It felt good. Taking that life with my bare hands felt natural. I haven't felt that way since my darker days. It worries me. If I become reckless, if I become more of a threat, I could be a very large danger to all of Equestria. The princesses need to be made aware of this. Twilight ceased her writing, the quill and scroll floating down next to the inkwell on her coffee table, before turning back to face him, a scowl coming over her face.
Excuse me? More of a threat? You're kidding, right?
He glanced over at her and simply shook his head, causing her to sigh and roll her eyes before raising a hoof to his hands.
Grevin, you need to stop this. You're not a threat. You're an asset, a friend. You were acting on instinct, yes, but look at what you did afterward. You thought about your actions and took logical steps to address your such concerns. If something were a true threat, then no such logic would be used and you wouldn't worry about it.
She quickly turned and returned to writing her notes to the princesses for a few seconds before rolling it up and sending it off with a powerful burst of magic.
Don't worry, I informed the princesses and I also put in my 2 cents as well. Now,
she glanced down a moment before smiling a bit sheepishly.
Would you care for a drink? To help your nerves, I mean.
He blinked and quietly nodded. All right, but are you sure? I shouldn't go. It is late.
Twilight quickly shook her head as she hopped up to her hooves and trotted into the kitchen.
Oh, no, of course not. It's no trouble. Just wait there a moment.
She hummed happily as she moved around in the kitchen, just out of sight, leaving Grevin to take in his surroundings, which he had failed to do in the rush to send his note to the princesses. Her home seemed typical enough, quite comfortable considering it was also a library. He took in the various tomes on the shelves that seemed to float around the room, noting how he would need to become more familiar with them when they were to begin their research. He caught the faint scent of lavender filling the air, sending a relaxing wave through him. He glanced near the windows, noting that they were drawn shut, blocking out all sight of the street, and that there were several candles lit throughout the room, giving it a very relaxed feeling. It was almost something that one would do in a romantic encounter. Uh-oh. His eyes widened as he glanced around, noting that indeed it was set up as a kind of tranquil date spot. The couch he sat on was even covered in a dark, soft cloth that was very smooth to his touch. He was suddenly having flashbacks to his incident with Fluttershy earlier in the evening, and a small chill started moving up his back. Twilight was still wearing most of her costume, which caught him by surprise. She still had her black choker and stockings on as well as the spell that affected her teeth and eyes. He quickly rose to his feet and took a few steps across the room, his mind racing as to how he could get back in another situation like this without causing more tears to flow from his friends. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft clearing of a throat.
Grevin, are you okay?
He glanced over his shoulder to see Twilight standing in the doorway, 2 tall glasses filled with something floating and her magic next to her. She had a small smile on her lips, her eyes seeming to shine in mirth as she looked at him.
You were pacing around like something trapped in a corner. You can relax now. Everything's done and over with.
She made her way over to the couch and hopped down onto one side, floating the drinks to the coffee table, setting them down with a soft clink.
Come back over and sit down, please?
He paused a moment, watching her carefully, specifically her eyes. He didn't see any hidden intent within them, so he moved back to where he had been seated and quickly took his place. Sure, sorry about that. I was lost in thought. He didn't want to admit that he did indeed feel a bit trapped, or at the least like some sort of prey. The romantic layout of the room, combined with the fact that Twilight still wore a portion of her costume, to him it felt like he was in a lair of a vampire ready to claim what she wants. The fact that she had let her mane down and surround her face in a somewhat messy halo also struck him somewhat. He glanced down, averting his gaze as he mentally kicked himself, trying to push the thoughts from his mind. He was beginning to blush. Twilight didn't miss his actions, nor the small hint of red on his cheeks, causing her eyes to soften a bit as the gears began to turn in her mind. Sure, he had come to her to send a letter and warn her about the changelings, but now that things had settled and the letter to the princesses was sent, maybe she could focus things into a more romantic direction. She quickly focused her magic on their drinks and levitated them over, making sure to set his in his hands before catching hers in her hooves.
Here, take a drink. I think you'll love it.
He shook the glass lightly and stirred the purple drink for a moment before looking back at her. What is it? She smiled and took a sip, her eyes closing in enjoyment for several seconds before swallowing.
It's a drink I learned to make in one of my cooking books. It's called the Lavender Longing. It uses berries as a flavoring agent that gives it its unique color and taste.
He glanced back at the drink and nodded. Well, it is an interesting name. He brought the drink to his lips and took a long sip. The flavor was amazing. It was smooth as it burst forth, unlike anything like he had tasted before. He licked his lips as he brought the glass away and nodded. That is one of the best tasting things I've ever had in my life. Where did you find this? Twilight simply smirked as she settled into a position so that her face was directly towards him, and took another sip of her drink.
It was in the book titled Top 100 Bar Drinks in Equestria. It's one of my personal favorites. I don't load it out to too many. It's really hard to find. As she was speaking, he had taken another drink, but paused after his third swallow, upon hearing her words. He slowly lowered the glass and cleared his throat. Wait, this is alcoholic? She smiled as she took another drink. Mm-hmm.
He glanced back down at the half-empty glass. It sure doesn't have the kick that other drinks have. Did you do something to it? She shook her head as she scooted a few inches closer.
You should be careful, though. These can sneak up on you. They're far stronger than the Apple Family Hard Cider. That's why I don't make them too often.
He nodded as he took another gulp. I can see why you feel that way. I think I have a new favorite drink, but that simply means I'll have to avoid it, lest I drink it too much. Twilight set her now empty glass down, and slowly rose up to sit on her back legs while keeping a soft gaze on Grevin.
If you like that one, maybe I can try and fix some others from that book for you, from time to time, of course.
She nervously chuckled while looking to the side. He took one last drink before setting his empty glass down. Well, perhaps, but only on holidays. I'm not a lush anymore, and I don't want to go back. Twilight simply smirked as she refocused her gaze, and lightly darted her tongue over her bottom lip, as she slowly moved closer to the unsuspecting man.
That's fair.
Grevin glanced over at her for a moment before doing a double take, noting first that she had moved much closer to him, and second that she was looking at him similarly to how Fluttershy had earlier. He needed to leave, now. Perhaps I should be going. It is late, and I'm sure you have to get some sleep before opening up the library. Twilight yawned a bit and lightly ran the tip of her tongue over her fangs as she leaned forward.
True. It is late. Perhaps you would prefer to stay here tonight? Then you could hurry back to the farm after you get some well-deserved rest.
Grevin paused and scooted himself back a bit, till he felt the arm of the couch push into his lower back. I'm sorry, Twilight, but I don't think that would be wise. Fluttershy made a similar offer at her cottage, and I turned it down as well, so if I were to stay here, it would upset her greatly. And on top of that, I'm sure Applejack and Big Macintosh will be needing my help with the orchard first thing in the morning. I don't want to end up showing up late and wear out my welcome on the farm. Twilight frowned as she slowly rose to her hooves, a small sigh escaping her. She wasn't happy at all. Fluttershy had made the first real move, it seems, and while she was a great friend, Twilight was jealous of the cream-colored mare. She closed her eyes and moved forward, taking small steps, stopping an inch from him now. She opened her eyes and focused on his, staring at him, unblinking as she raised her right hoof, and gently placed it against his chest. She couldn't help but smile at the warmth radiating through the thin fabric of his shirt, as well as the feeling of his pulse increasing in pace as she watched him.
Grevin, I'm guessing that Fluttershy told you how she feels about you. Am I correct? Did she do anything with you?
He nodded as he shifted his weight a bit to stay comfortable, letting his hands rest at his sides. The feeling of her soft hoof against his chest was not an unwelcome feeling. Well, in a manner, I think it was more a result of the alcohol than anything, though. I don't feel right getting into any details. She smiled at his words and nodded.
I wouldn't either, but I want you to know that she isn't the only one of us who really likes you. As something more than just a friend, you know.
She locked her gaze with him once more, and allowed her eyes to become half-lidded as she slowly began to close the gap between them. She placed a hoof between his knees for balance as she continued, the scent from his sweat making its way to her nose, making her take a deep inhale, committing his scent to memory. A frown graced his lips as he brought his hand up to her shoulders, hoping to push her back before something happened. Twilight! The moment he touched her, her form flared to life, and a magical aura gripped hold of his wrists, flinging them away from her, her smile growing. She shook her head as she moved closer, stopping only once she was nearly atop him, her lips barely an inch from his now. her breath softly washing over his face.
No, Grevin. I told you earlier that I did want to get some things out of my system before we lose focus on our research, didn't I? Well, I have something else I want to do before I lose my nerve.
Twilight, what are you doing? Let's not do anything rash now, all right? He could feel her trembling against him with each breath she took. She said nothing for a moment, then began to close her eyes as a simple phrase softly escaped her lips.
Just one kiss.
She quickly leaned forward, eliminating the space between them, and brushed her lips against his with as much passion as she could muster, enjoying the warmth that seemed to burst from her heart the moment she made contact. Grevin's eyes were wide open, blinking in momentary shock. She was kissing him. It was like Fluttershy all over again. Her lips were so soft, and the feeling of her pressing against him nearly made him crumble. He could feel part of him pushing to embrace her, to hold her and return the kiss, while his other half screamed at him to back away. The latter won. He jerked his head back, trying to place some distance between the two of them, causing him to fall backwards over the arm of the couch, landing hard on his back while his legs remained pinned by Twilight up on the couch, leaving him in a very awkward position. Ugh, Twilight, wait a moment. He tried to adjust his position by sitting up on his elbows, but Twilight gave him little time before she was on him again. She moved over him, placing her hooves on either side of his head while straddling his prone form.
Grevin, please, humor me for now. I simply want you to know how I feel. I felt a connection with you from the moment you saved Fluttershy, and it's only grown in intensity since then. After you walked me home after that party, well, I will admit I was drunk, but you were so kind and gentle, I couldn't help myself. However, when you saved Shining and Armor and Cadence without a single thought about your life, well, they're my family. You saved them. How could I not develop feelings for you after that? She leaned down once more while her tail slowly brushed over his leg and drug itself up to his thigh. I've gone over in my head so many times the ways I could show you my feelings for you. I could give you a book, but I didn't know what kind of you might enjoy. I could write it out in scientific theory, but that would take ages. I could write it in the sky with magic, but that would be so over the top that Trixie would take notes. So I want to show you in the best way I can. Please, let me kiss you just once without you trying to pull into your shell, without you retreating.
For a few moments nothing was said between them, both simply staring into the eyes of the other until Grevin took a slow breath. Twilight, I'm not sure I can. Fluttershy opened up to me not long ago, and I ran, and now here I am with you ready to do the same thing. I'm not good for you girls when it comes to love. Twilight smirked and moved closer, letting her rump press against his thighs while sliding a hoof over his chest.
Don't you think we should decide that? I'm certain you can make things up to Fluttershy, but to be honest, I'm focused on something else right now.
Twilight closed her eyes and moved down, pressing her lips against his once more in a slow, searing kiss. She let out a soft moan as she darted her tongue forward, letting it brush against his lips, begging for entrance. Grevin sat wide-eyed for a moment, until the sensation from her tongue pulled him back to reality. He couldn't believe that it was happening twice in one night, and furthermore, he was beginning to enjoy it. She pressed in harder, causing him to part his lips, giving her the opportunity to slide her tongue into his mouth and begin to wrestle for dominance. She couldn't help but let out a small squeal in her victory as she felt his hands begin to slide up her sides and around her barrel, pulling her closer to him, his touch being enough to send a shiver down her spine. Grevin cleared his throat for a moment as he looked up into Twilight's eyes before his shy nature kicked him and forced him to cast his gaze to the side while his cheeks burned red. That was nice. Twilight grinned as she slowly maneuvered herself off of him, allowing him to get back to his feet.
I thought so too. Do you think we can do it again sometime?
She looked up at him with a hopeful smile. He cleared his throat once more as he rose to his feet, shuffling them slightly as he tried to find the words he wanted to speak. Twilight, I don't know if that would be a good idea. I'm not used to having anyone favor me in this manner. I don't want to hurt anyone. She frowned a bit and shook her head, her mane washing over her eyes a bit.
Grevin.
He took a quick step back and turned to avoid looking into her eyes. I should go. It's late. You need sleep and we have research to do soon. Perhaps we could talk about this another time. She could barely answer as he began to pick up his armor and move towards the door.
Well, yes, I suppose.
Great. I'll see you later then. He opened the door and gave a courteous bow before stepping through it and out into the dark night, leaving Twilight sitting in her room to deal with a strong mixture of emotion. She slowly shut the door as a small tear ran down her cheeks as questions began to run through her mind. Had her kiss been that bad? Did she scare him off? Did he prefer Fluttershy or even Applejack? Just how much did he know about relationships in Equestria? She sighed as she thought back to the moment she brought her lips to his and smiled once more. It was enjoyable, but she did want to do it again. But she knew she needed to talk to her friends about this. While she didn't want to give too much detail, she knew that she could always count on her friends for advice. She also had a small bit of worry in the back of her mind. If Grevin faced a changeling, and there were more around, could it be possible Chrysalis could be leading them? Was there a bigger threat looming on the horizon? A small sigh escaped her as she began to extinguish candles while making her way back up the stairs for the night. There wasn't anything else she could do that night, and she needed her sleep. Perhaps for some rest she could figure out if she could get a fresh perspective on things. As she slid under the covers of her bed, a simple thought passed through her mind, and she couldn't help but smile with a small giggle. She had kissed her crush, and it felt good. She hoped that in the future she could do it again, and make it an even better experience.